Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Global Geopolitics, Wednesday, August 19. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Let me begin with something that won't appear in any single headline, because it lives in the space between them. Consider a day's worth of the world's news. An earthquake on an Indonesian island, 7.7, some 50 people dead, 5,000 displaced, whole villages cut off from electricity and telephone. On the same day, 300 killed by another quake in the west of Colombia, in Cali and Pereira, cities most listeners could not place on a map. Belgium, of all the temperate, unremarkable places, fighting one of the worst wildfires in its history. 2,700 hectares gone. The European Union scrambling water bombers. Floods in the northwest of Spain, killing 2 women and injuring 2 infants, arriving, note this, on the heels of weeks of heat wave and fire. Hawaii bracing for what could be its first direct hurricane strike in 34 years. Indiana counting its flood dead. Now the casual reader files each of these under natural disaster and turns the page. That is the mistake I want to sit with, because when you lay them side by side, a pattern emerges that is not natural at all. It is political, and the connective tissue running through the whole day's catastrophe is a single unglamorous word: capacity. Who has it, who is losing it, and who never had it to begin with? Watch what the Colombian president does when the earth stops shaking. He does not simply mourn and rebuild. He picks up the telephone and asks Washington to suspend its tariffs, because reconstruction is estimated at $6.5 billion, and his country is being taxed at the border by the very power he must ask for help. There, in one gesture, is the whole architecture of the current moment. A humanitarian emergency instantly becomes a negotiation over trade policy. The disaster is real. The response is geopolitical. Relief is no longer a matter of shared human decency, but a chip in a bargaining game, and the country holding the chips is the same one that lit the tariff match. And this is the through line I want to establish, because it explains far more than any one story. The state of the field, as I read it, is a quiet crisis of who can actually do things. Look again. In California, the wildfires burn while the federal firefighting workforce is hollowed out. Low pay, cost of living pressure, and cuts from the current administration leaving fewer hands to hold the line. So the fire is nature. The shortage of firefighters is a choice. 2 countries, 2 disasters, and in both the American state is the variable, present in Colombia as an obstacle, absent in California as a vacuum. The superpower is no longer the reliable backstop of the international order. It has become an unpredictable actor whose decisions ripple into whether a Colombian town gets rebuilt or a Californian one burns. Notice, too, how allies are beginning to respond to that unpredictability. A Canadian petition to expel the American ambassador gathers 170,000 signatures, enough to force a debate in the House of Commons. That is not a policy, it is a mood, and moods among neighbors are the raw material from which realignments are eventually built. The old assumption that the friends of the United States are its friends by default is being quietly audited. Then set beside all this, the wars which never stop. Ukraine now sends 600 drones against Moscow in a single night, while missiles fall on Kyiv. A NATO jet downs a drone over Romania. Israel strikes southern Lebanon in its deadliest raids since June. Families fleeing north. Hezbollah promising retaliation. Iran negotiating over the Strait of Hormuz while quarreling with Qatar over captured pilots. The Houthis on the offensive again in Yemen. And underneath the geopolitics, the human texture in Gaza, the search for a working cigarette lighter becomes the difference between a cooked meal and hunger. That detail is worth holding. When a civilization's infrastructure collapses far enough, the frontier of survival shrinks to the size of a flame you can strike. So here is where the field stands. And here is the argument I mean to build across our time together. The old story was globalization. Everything connected, borders softening, a single interdependent system. The new story is not disconnection. It is something stranger, a world still utterly interlinked, so that a tariff decision and a wildfire and an earthquake all bleed into one another. But with the machinery for collective response corroding at precisely the moment the shocks are multiplying. The climate is delivering more Belgiums and more Spains. The politics is delivering fewer functioning firefighters and more weaponized aid. And yet, lest I leave you in despair, the same day carries a beach cafe opening in Gaza. Roses dropped from Syrian helicopters where bombs once fell, and Bangladesh beating Australia at cricket for the first time in history. The capacity to endure, it seems, outlasts the capacity to govern. Hold that tension. We will need it. Where we go next is into the machinery itself, into how these shocks propagate, and why the wiring of the world has grown so much faster than its fuses. If you lay a single day's news out on a table and stare at it long enough, something unsettling happens. The particulars begin to blur, and a shape rises up from underneath. That shape is what I want to trace now, because it is the deep current beneath all the froth. And it is not the war you are thinking of, nor the election, nor the drone that fell out of the Romanian sky. Consider what one ordinary day placed before us. An earthquake in Indonesia, flattening more than 1,000 homes and displacing 5,000 souls. Another earthquake in Colombia, 300 dead in Cali and Pereira, with reconstruction estimated at more than $6 billion. A record wildfire in Belgium, mark you, that damp and temperate country, scorching thousands of hectares while the European Union scrambles water bombers. A flood in northwestern Spain, killing 2 women and injuring 2 infants, arriving hard on the heels of weeks of heatwave and fire. Floods in Indiana. A hurricane bearing down on Hawaii, threatening the first direct hit in 34 years. A ferry capsizing on Lake Kariba, 72 dead. Each of these is a discrete tragedy. Taken together, they are a pattern. And the pattern is this. The physical world is becoming less reliable at precisely the moment our political world is becoming less capable of responding to it. That is the deep current. Not any single disaster, but the widening gap between the scale of shocks arriving and the capacity of institutions to absorb them. Watch how the 2 halves of that gap reveal themselves. On one side, Colombia's new president, standing amid the rubble of 2 cities, turns not to a treaty of mutual aid nor to a regional fund, but to a single foreign leader, asking that tariffs be suspended so that his stricken country might breathe. Think on what that request tells you. A natural catastrophe now collides directly with a trade policy, and the victims of an earthquake find their recovery mortgaged to the mood of a customs schedule drawn up in another hemisphere. The disaster is geological. The obstacle is entirely man-made. And there is no smoothing mechanism between them, no cushion, no automatic solidarity, only a personal appeal from one head of state to another. On the other side of that gap, look at who is meant to do the responding. In California, the federal wildland firefighting workforce is fraying, low pay, the impossible cost of living, budget cuts, even as multiple fires burn at once. Here is the quiet scandal beneath the flames. We speak endlessly of resilience, but resilience is not an abstraction. It is a person willing to walk toward a fire for a wage they can live on. When we hollow out that person, we hollow out the response, and the shocks that were always coming arrive to find the door unattended. Now, one might object that humanity has always faced earthquakes and floods, that the world has never been a gentle place. Quite so. But the current runs deeper than the frequency of the shocks. It runs through the erosion of the shared machinery meant to meet them. Notice the smaller signals scattered across the same day, each pointing the same direction. A petition in Canada to expel an ambassador. Migrants massing at Ceuta, summoned by a social media campaign, intercepted by police, desperation organized online, met by force at a fence. fuel prices in Nigeria, driving riders onto electric bikes, an adaptation born not of policy, but of individual necessity. Even Gaza's improvised economy of the humble cigarette lighter, where the presence or absence of a flame decides whether a family eats a cooked meal, is the same story told at its most intimate scale. When the large systems fail, life reorganizes itself around the smallest available tools. This is what a weakening order looks like from the inside. It does not announce itself with a single collapse. It shows up as 1,000 people improvising around absences that ought to have been filled by something larger than themselves. It shows up as nations retreating into the transactional, a favor asked here, a tariff wielded there, because the multilateral cushions that once distributed shock have grown thin. And it shows up in the strange fact that in the same news cycle, we can find both a genocide and an election turning, we are told, on issues far closer to home. That is not callousness, so much as exhaustion. When the shocks are relentless, attention itself becomes a scarce resource, and people ration it toward what is nearest. So the deep current is a story of divergence. The demands upon our collective institutions are rising, climatically, seismically, economically, while the willingness and the means to meet those demands together are quietly draining away. The froth on the surface tells us who struck whom and who leads whom. The current beneath tells us something harder and slower, that the world is being asked to catch more falling weight with fewer hands, and that the hands, increasingly, are being asked to fend for themselves. Hold that thought, because whether that current can be reversed or merely endured is the question we turn to next. We come now to the part of the conversation that matters most, which is what all of this actually means once you set the individual stories side by side and let them speak to one another. Because on the surface, a day of world news looks like a heap of unrelated fragments. An earthquake here, an airstrike there, a cricket result, a swimming medal, a ferry that capsized on a lake in Zimbabwe. The temptation is to read them as noise, but the discipline of this show is to ask whether the fragments are, in fact, arranged along a few deep fault lines, and I think they are. Consider first the sheer density of catastrophe arriving from the natural world. A magnitude 7.7 quake off Flores, a devastating earthquake in Colombia that has flattened parts of Cali and Pereira. Record wildfire in Belgium, of all places, not Greece, not California, but Belgium, with the European Union scrambling water bombers across borders. Floods in northwestern Spain following weeks of heat, floods in Indiana, a hurricane bearing down on Hawaii for the first direct hit in 3 decades. Now, no single one of these tells you anything about the whole, but taken together they describe a world in which the capacity to respond to disaster is being tested simultaneously in many places at once. And that simultaneity is the second-order story. Emergency response has always assumed that catastrophe is local, that when one region burns, others can send helicopters, crews, money. What you want to watch is the moment when the demand curve outruns the supply of mutual aid. When the firefighters themselves are, as in one account here, underpaid and depleted by budget cuts, even as the fires multiply. The resilience of a system is invisible until the day it is asked to do everything everywhere. And notice how disaster now bleeds directly into geopolitics. A newly installed Colombian president responds to an earthquake not only by mobilizing rescue, but by asking Washington to suspend tariffs, because reconstruction is estimated at over $6 billion, and the country is simultaneously being squeezed by trade penalties. That is the tell. In an earlier era, a natural disaster prompted a pause in political hostilities, an instinct toward grace. What we are watching instead is disaster becoming another lever in an ongoing negotiation, where the question is whether economic pressure will be lifted for a grieving nation or held as leverage. The humanitarian and the transactional have merged, and the merger is not accidental. It reflects a broader recalibration of American power toward the explicitly conditional, which brings us to the second fault line, the steady normalization of escalation. 600 drones over Moscow in a single night, missiles into Kyiv, a NATO jet downing a drone over Romanian territory. Israeli strikes into southern Lebanon, described as the deadliest since a June truce, with families fleeing north and Hezbollah promising retaliation. Iran and Oman negotiating over the Strait of Hormuz, while Qatar denies holding captured pilots. Each of these is reported as a discrete incident, but the pattern to watch is the erosion of the threshold, the point at which a drone crossing a NATO border, once unthinkable, becomes a line item. Thresholds matter because they are how wars stay contained. When each transgression is met with a proportionate but tolerated response, the ceiling rises quietly, and one day you find yourself somewhere no one chose to go. The absence of shock is itself the danger signal. And underneath the grand strategy, always, the texture of ordinary endurance. There is a detail I cannot stop turning over, that in Gaza a simple lighter has become the difference between a cooked meal and going to bed hungry. That a journalist there has chosen, against every reasonable expectation, to open a beach café. In Nigeria, riders switching to electric bikes because petrol has become unaffordable. These are not soft human interest garnishes on the hard news. They are the ground truth of what policy produces. When you want to understand the real weight of a blockade, a war, a fuel crisis, you do not look at the communiques. You look at whether a family can find a flame to light the stove. The second-order implication is that populations adapt with astonishing ingenuity long before institutions acknowledge the problem, and that adaptation is both a triumph of the human spirit and an alibi for those who caused the deprivation. So what should you watch? Watch whether mutual aid holds as disasters stack. Watch whether the transactional replaces the humanitarian as the default posture between states. Watch the thresholds, the drones over borders, the truces quietly abandoned, and watch the small economies of survival, the lighters and the electric bikes and the café by the sea, because they are the earliest, most honest indicators we have. Bangladesh, after all, just won a test match in Australia that the cricketing world thought impossible, which is a reminder, on a day this heavy, that the established order is never quite as fixed as it appears. That, perhaps, is the note to end on. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming, we'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.